All right, let's talk about Harry S. Truman. You know, they called him the accidental president, and in just a couple of years, he made two just massive decisions that shaped the entire 20th century. One involved a brand new, terrifying weapon, and the other, a completely new kind of alliance.
Okay, so try to put yourself in his shoes for a second. When Harry Truman takes the oath of office, he has absolutely no idea that America is on the cusp of creating the most destructive weapon in all of human history. Can you believe that? The new president of the United States was completely, totally in the dark about the atomic bomb.
So how did this all happen? Well, Truman's journey to the presidency began out of the blue. It's April 1945. President Franklin D. Roosevelt dies, and just like that, this farmer from Missouri is in charge of the whole country. And get this, the war in Europe is just about over, but the fight against Japan, it's still raging with this just terrifying intensity.
And you got to look at how fast this all went down. April 12th, he becomes president. Less than 2 weeks later, we're talking April 25th, he's finally briefed on the biggest secret on the entire planet, the Manhattan Project. I mean, can you imagine? Suddenly the fate of the war, and really the whole world, rested on a choice he never even knew he'd have to make.
And this brings us to his first, just monumental crisis. To end the war with Japan, well, every single option on the table was horrific. I mean, truly, deeply awful. There was no good choice here. There was only a terrible one.
So Truman was facing this brutal calculus. On one hand, an invasion of Japan. After the absolute bloodbath at Okinawa, projections were showing staggering U.S. casualties, maybe up to 268,000 in just the first phase. So what was the alternative? Use this terrifying new weapon to force a quick surrender. But the question was, at what cost? If you look at his own diary, Truman seems to express his intention pretty clearly. He actually wrote that he wanted to limit the harm to civilians, saying the target would be purely military. So that was the goal he set for himself, at least on paper. But, and this is a big but, this is where the story gets a lot more complicated. The official target committee, the guys at Los Alamos, they actually argued for the exact opposite. They recommended hitting big urban areas to create the biggest possible shock value and really show off the bomb's awesome, terrible power. And, well, this was the outcome. Hiroshima. It was a city that did have a military presence, sure, but it was ultimately chosen to deliver that shock. It became the target that would demonstrate America's warning of prompt and utter destruction.
And you better believe this decision sparked a debate that is still raging today. On one side, you've got what we call the traditionalist view. The bomb was absolutely necessary to save lives and avoid a bloody invasion. But on the other side, you have the revisionist view. Japan was already beaten, they were about to surrender anyway, and the real knockout punch was the Soviet invasion of Manchuria. This whole controversy, it's really central to the bomb's legacy.
And look, don't think for a second this was just some academic debate for future historians. No way. Even at the time, some of the top military brass were absolutely horrified. Admiral William Leahy, this is Truman's own chief of staff, he called the use of the bomb a descent into barbarism. So the moral conflict here, it was immediate and it was intense.
So, with Japan's surrender, World War II was finally over. You'd think there'd be this huge global sigh of relief, right? But the relief was pretty short-lived. A new, much colder fear was already creeping across the globe. So what was going on?
Well, this brings us right to Truman's second great crisis, and it's one that was born directly from the power vacuum and the fear left behind by the first one. The Soviet Union, who had been an ally, was now seen as this huge expansionist threat looming over a shattered and vulnerable Europe. It was pretty clear a new kind of shield was needed. And believe me, the threat escalated fast. First, the Soviets started tightening their grip on Eastern Europe. Then, a communist-backed coup toppled the government in Czechoslovakia. And then, the big one, in 1948. Stalin blockades West Berlin, bringing the superpowers right to the brink of another war. For a continent just crawling out of one conflict, the fear was, well, you can imagine, it was everywhere.
So what does Truman do? His first response was a really radical break from American tradition. It was called the Truman Doctrine, and it basically declared that the U.S. would support free nations under threat. This was a huge deal. This was the end of American isolationism and the real beginning of the policy we now call containment.
In his big address to Congress, Truman framed this as a global struggle. He basically argued that American security wasn't just about protecting its own borders anymore. Nope,
It was now a commitment to defending democracy everywhere. The age of American isolationism was officially over.
But, this new doctrine, it needed some teeth. So the path to NATO was really methodical. First, a few key European nations performed their own defense pact. Then, and this was crucial, a resolution passed in the U.S. Congress that allowed America to join its first ever military alliance during peacetime. And then finally, in 1949, NATO was officially born.
Okay, so how do we connect these two massive decisions? The bomb on one hand and this new alliance on the other? Well, as it turns out, they were really two sides of the same strategic coin.
Think about it like this. On one side, you've got the bomb. That's the ultimate expression of unilateral hard power. It's a weapon to end one war and show off American dominance. But on the other side, you've got NATO, a multilateral, group commitment to collective security, an alliance designed to prevent the next war. So one was a sword, the other was a shield, and both were designed to secure America's new role in a very dangerous new world.
And the debate over that sword, it continues to this very day. Just look at this 2015 poll. It shows this stark generational divide. You've got 70% of Americans over 65 who believe the bombing was justified, but that number drops to less than half for young adults. This isn't just dusty old history, folks. It's a living, breathing controversy.
So in the end, what we have is the story of an accidental president who made two of the most consequential decisions of modern history. One of them ended the world's deadliest war, while the other drew the battle lines for the Cold War that followed. Truman literally built a new world order on these twin foundations, atomic power and collective defense. And it's a legacy of incredibly hard choices that, honestly, we are still grappling with today.